What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Wealth of the Futures channel. And I want to just give a shout out to all my new subscribers. Thanks for tuning in. I hope in 2018 I'm able to provide you amazing and valuable content. And for those that are new who haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please consider subscribing. And if you find this video helpful, hit that like button. It helps others find this content. I do have the live chat open, the pop-up window on a dual screen. So if you guys have questions as I walk through this presentation on EOS, feel free to chime in with any of those, and I'll do my best to get you guys an answer. Now, before I start, I just wanted to mention that this slide deck, which I'm going to be presenting, is actually something I put together. It is an ongoing draft, if you will, for the EOS community. So it's something that people can use in their communities to help spread awareness and information on this technology, which I think is going to be a big game changer. That's why I invest, volunteer basically my time in this project, help support the community, and help organize it, really. I think it's going to be amazing. So on a lot of different fronts. And we're going to get into some of that today. So again, if you just joined, thank you so much for tuning in, especially on a Saturday. I know you guys could be doing a lot of other things, and you know, most average people are, but you know, we are trying to create the technologies that'll literally change the world. So can't do that without investing some time, right? So without further statements like that, I just want to provide a legal disclaimer. You know, this presentation is not considered investment advice, guys. The presentation that I'm going to provide you guys today is intended for educational purposes only, and it's really intended for the community. As you guys know, EOS tokens have no rights, uses, or attributes. The EOS tokens do not have any rights, uses, purpose, attributes, functionalities, or features expressed or implied, including without limitation, any uses, purposes, attributes, functionalities, or features on the EOS platform. And obviously, the company does not guarantee and is not representing in any way to the buyer that the EOS tokens have any of these features. So do your own research, guys. This is more technical information. So without further ado on the legal disclaimer information, I want to start today's presentation with actually a video by Brendan Bloomer. He is the Chief Executive Officer of EOS.io. So this video is going to provide an overview on why blockchain technology will actually change the world. Now, whether it's EOS or maybe another platform that is in the running for this competition, you know, why are we looking at this as essentially the new internet, and why is it going to affect so many industries? Let's hear what he has to say.
Blockchains are based on the concept of free speech. Everything you say is published to a blockchain. The blockchain is an irreversible public record that's replicated across computers all over the world. There's no one server that you can shut down that can take away what you've said.
Every transaction or every message sent over the blockchain is as if a notary has stamped it. By using the summation of world computing power to perform an equation, what we call a hash, and that allows us to ensure that it hasn't been tampered with.
We really want to remove corruption from everything. We want to make everything resilient, not just to corruption, but to any type of interference from those who would attempt to shut down or harm what we want to do as a free society. And so by having not one source of truth, but many sources of truth that are all in consensus and all in agreement, we can build really powerful systems that can change the world.
Banking, legal, all of these things are just going to be layers of technology that speak to each other and allow us to trust the technology in an auditable, inclusive way without having to rely on any centralized entities to look out on our behalf.
Peer-to-peer systems resist corruption, they resist attempts to shut them down, they route around censorship. There's no single point of failure. The internet itself is peer-to-peer, and it was designed to resist nuclear war.
So what we're seeing is publicly traded companies, large exchanges, a lot of the projects that have reached the limits of what existing platforms can do today, getting very excited about what EOS fundamentally makes possible.
And this is potentially the software that may change the world.
By allowing every individual to have more oversight on a consistent basis on how things are operated, how money is spent, ensures that there's just more accountability and more efficiency in the way that we do things. I believe it represents the next evolution of human assembly.
Blockchain technology, and EOS in particular, are background technologies. So it's like the technologies that connect the banks. It's the technologies that power every website you use.
Blockchains are just a really better data architecture. It's a database. And you shouldn't know how databases work in the same way you don't need to know how the technology in your phone works, because it's not relevant. What they need are products and services that are going to change and improve their lives.
The first time an average person hears about an insurance product, for example, that halves their premiums and gives them more inclusive service that they can rely on, when a child with cystic fibrosis has to submit some type of experimental surgery to the insurance claim, and they're being judged or approved by other people in their same situation. This is going to lead people to adopt cryptocurrencies so that they can take advantages of the services that lower premiums or provide just fundamentally better products.
We're disrupting the centralized services that are taking a cut out of everything.
These systems in which the internet is built on was still a world designed for paper. And at some point we have to throw out the old system. And the blockchain is essentially the enabling technology on which we're building the new world.
That means having reputation, identity, dispute resolution, all on a blockchain.
We take these things for granted, that we've got bank accounts and credit cards and these things that make our lives kind of function well, and most of the world doesn't have it. And so in the same way that the internet democratized knowledge and information and communication, this technology is about to democratize the financial world, and it's the least fortunate people on the planet that stand to benefit the most from it.
I'm continually blown away at the things that people are coming out and talking to us about, whether it's using the blockchain to subsidize universal basic income, to using the blockchain to curb global warming. What I've seen and what I've become convinced is that the blockchain is capable of doing things that even governments are not.
All right, guys. So hope you guys enjoyed that and kind of got some perspective on really the driver of blockchain technologies, not necessarily EOS specifically, but just blockchains and why it's really a game changer. And I think that's a very powerful video to open up this presentation with. So before we get into EOS and some of the essentials and goals on what they're trying to do, I wanted to introduce to everybody, especially the newer folks, what are some of the essential parts of a blockchain? Because I think for people to understand why this is going to change the world, it's sort of important to know the core components of what the blockchain is and why those parts are essential and such a game changer in a sense. So I added a couple slides here, especially for the newer folks, for people who have invested in blockchain for a long time. This is probably in many cases redundant, but what you guys have to understand is that in 2018 we're seeing a huge surge in people interested in blockchain projects, and having a video like this with an overview on blockchain technologies is actually very valuable to give them perspective and things to look at and consider. So one of the main parts of a blockchain is obviously the list of records shared among all of its members. So whether you're talking about Ethereum or EOS in the future or others, and even something like Bitcoin, all those platforms or projects essentially have a list of records shared among its members. And the reason why this is so powerful and so different from what we're used to is that in today's world, we obviously have many different databases in our legacy companies and systems, and these are siloed. They're not available to regular people. So there's what we call in game theory information asymmetry, which means you may not have the same information as a large bank or company, because many of the cases that information is hidden behind a silo database which you do not have access to. The other components of this is by having what's called the distributed ledger. What that means is the records are basically shared amongst the different users. It makes it more difficult to shut down versus something that is centralized. So you can imagine if you had one database in a very large company and something were to happen to that company, it were to be shut down, or the records were to be manipulated in some way, it would be a little bit more difficult to prove there was some fishy business going on, versus if you have thousands, millions of users which have a copy of that database, which are tracking all the changes and essentially agreeing on the changes in the status of those records. And that's what we call consensus, which we'll get into in the subsequent slides. So with this, we have multiple sources of truth. And I put truth in quotes because it doesn't necessarily mean it is the truth, but it is a truth that most of the members can agree to. And it's also typically immutable and irreversible. So once a record is changed, it lives on the blockchain and it can be referenced in the future for any issues or questions, which is a very neat feature that we do not have today. So the other parts of a blockchain, we have the consensus model. Now, irrespective of what platform you're talking about, there is a consensus model. And what this is it is a method to determine agreement about what has and what hasn't happened to the ledger, or what we call the records, which I shared in just the previous slide. So you can see here a classical discussion on what is called the generals problem. And in this case, there's some discussion about if you have what we call bad actors in any communications system or any organization really, and there's corruption in what was supposed to happen, how do you mitigate for this? And so in blockchain technologies, a heavy emphasis is placed on guarding against these bad actors. One way to do that is through having multiple witnesses, having multiple people to basically validate what has happened on that system, as opposed to just one person making a statement and that being the fact, which we know in today's world is quite arguably very challenging to do, right? If you have one person that is the end-all be-all of things that have occurred and it's potentially hearsay, that can be challenging in establishing contracts, deals, and in disputes. So having a consensus that is hopefully distributed and having a community that buys in on the rules of that, I guess that community itself, that helps determine the agreement about what has and hasn't happened, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here. So other parts of the blockchain, you have your public and private keys. So what do we mean by this? Well, obviously a public key is used to identify transactions associated with an entity. So that could be an individual, an organization, a company, a robot, or others, really. And it allows people in that community to identify your entity through the public key and any transactions that have occurred. And the private key is used primarily for signing of transactions on that network. So you have both a public key, and that is typically broadcasted on that platform. You can actually track some of these transactions. There are a couple exceptions to that. And you have a private key, which is something that you typically only know, or you should only know, because having access to the private key gives the ability to move your tokens or coins between you and maybe another entity. So you wouldn't want people to have your private key. So a couple different examples of a consensus model is what we call proof of work. This is actually what is used by Bitcoin. And what it is a series of hashes. Okay, there's a block head, what we call a block header, and there's a nonce, which is really just a number generator or a random number that is associated and attached to the hashes. And obviously we have the root hash, which is made up of the current transactions. That is passed into a hash algorithm, which just is a way to input the information into this algorithm and determine if there's a desired output. The whole point in doing all this work is to prevent attacks on the network and to have a way to validate and reward for validation of transactions. So the 4 steps would be the hash with the nonce is basically generated as an input that is run through this hash function. The output of that hash function is checked to see if it basically adheres to the criteria for being accepted to the network in terms of, typically it's leading zeros. And if it meets the criteria, that is broadcasted to the network so the other miners or participants in the validation of the transactions can check his or her work and make sure it's valid. If so, they add the block to their local copy of the blockchain and move on to finding the next block. So that's really what, in a sense, proof of work is. Some of the challenges with it obviously is there is no walled garden in a sense of who is allowed to do the proof of work. So it could be anyone across the world doing this work. And that could be potentially a subject of an attack on the network. The other aspect to this is it's very energy intensive. So it takes a tremendous amount of energy to do, obviously, all this work, which is what we've heard about Bitcoin. And that could also translate into higher fees, slower transactions, etc. So what are some other examples of consensus? Well, another example of this would be delegated proof of stake, which should not be confused with proof of stake. But I'm going to just put this into a very basic layman's way to understand what a delegated proof of stake is. Okay, we're not going to get into all the nitty gritty because that's not what this slide is. This slide deck is intended to do. But in a sense, it is people in a particular community voting for witnesses or people who say what happens on that network. Only the top witnesses are paid for their service. They earn usually a regular salary, and because many want to become the witness, there are like hundreds of backup witnesses as well. Now, people's vote strength is determined by how many tokens they hold. So the influence on who actually is a witness is really determined on the voting power of the people of that community. And obviously, the more tokens you hold within this community, the more influence you have on who you choose. If a witness stops doing a quality job securing the network, people in the community can remove their votes for that person or that entity and essentially fire the bad actor. The voting is always ongoing, and regardless of the capital or amount of dollars, one is only able to participate as a witness if they are voted on by the community to secure the network. So this is a key distinction between proof of stake and delegated proof of stake, is that it's not just having the amount of tokens, it's also the buy-in and reputation potentially within that community. So it's a little harder to potentially attack the community in that way because of the additional requirements to actually become a witness. So now we talked about a couple consensus examples. I want to kind of introduce you guys to what a smart contract is anyway. And for, again, many of you guys who have already invested in a lot of cryptocurrencies, this is not new, but we got to provide an overview for those that are new. So smart contracts consist of marrying, and this is my own kind of way to explain it, but it's a marriage of business logic to money by attaching validation scripts to transactions for the contractual agreements of value. Value obviously can be a lot of different things, but we have an example here of some target industries for smart contracts. One of the primary ones is insurance markets. So you look at cars, health, and travel insurance, and basically all those margins for these companies that facilitate insurance contracts for you and I, their margins and really their business to finance their overhead, to finance their CEOs, their managers, okay, and pay those salaries and bonuses. Most of that stuff could be automated. And so what you have with smart contracts is you bring the margins from wherever they're at today to, which could be multiples of % of the revenue that the company collects, to basically zero. And by doing that, you can pass on that savings to the community members of that platform, right? Or that entity that would basically start this company on the blockchain. You also have the same thing in financial markets, same deal here. You have a lot of people on Wall Street, a lot of brokers and researchers and people who maybe manage money, and basically those can be brought to less than percentage of what they charge their customers now. You could have similar things in infrastructure. The big ones are also personal identity and reputation, which we haven't seen a lot of yet, but I expect to see more of that. And then entertainment's another big one that I'm focused on, which is digital intellectual property and content consumption. So if you're a musician or singer and you're trying to distribute your content, and right now you're using YouTube and other platforms like that, there's no way for you to necessarily validate all the views or consumptions across several different mediums. And there's no way to control your intellectual property. So there are a lot of platforms that are starting up right now which are intending to address that issue. And then the last one, which is really interesting, is the virtual market space, which would be like virtual reality. It could be virtual weapons. It could be basically virtual goods. There's a whole market for that, and there's a whole generation, in fact, I expect that will be influenced more by those types of technologies as we move forward in the future. So if you guys have watched some of my other videos, you know that's been a huge area of interest for me, and that's where I'm basically placing my bets. So snapshot of existing blockchain technologies today, and what are some of the things they were able to accomplish? Well, we had Bitcoin with Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008, which obviously spread the word on blockchain technology, and it promised the inspirations of both digital cash and smart contracts. And following, Bitcoin's set on the stage and really starting this whole growth in the ecosystem is we had Ethereum in 2014 or around there, which attempted to fulfill the smart contract promise that Bitcoin had with what they called the unstoppable world computer. And Ethereum was successful in some ways in that it was able to really spur on the ICO craze. I mean, that's what this whole ecosystem has turned into, right? You see a lot of these successful ICOs that have come on, products starting to get delivered, and that's really nice to see. And then we had, other projects like Dan Larimer's BitShares in 2014, which demonstrated the ability to open up the market for tradable assets, right? Now, a lot of people don't actually even know about BitShares yet, but BitShares is pretty amazing. Some of the issues it has, right now is the user friendliness, in my opinion. But it is an interesting project in the sense that it provides a DEX, if you will, or distributed exchange. Okay, it's not centralized like Coinbase or some of the other ones you guys might be familiar with. And you're going to start to see more of these. So that's why I picked these three main projects. They are game changers in their own ways. And another one would be Steemit, which wasn't listed here, but is also a pretty demonstratable project at this time in terms of blockchains that have actually done a couple things. But the big ones being Bitcoin and Ethereum, in my opinion. Bitcoin because of its spreading the awareness of blockchain and some sense of digital cash in the early stages. And now Bitcoin's seen more as a store of value, like gold. Digital gold is what it is, because the transactions, the speed and the volume it cannot necessarily keep up with. So we've seen it kind of transition into that role, and we'll have to see how that continues to evolve. So with that said, where does EOS stack in terms of the slide I just shared with you guys, right? If you look here, I shared with you Bitcoin, which started on this track of doing, performing the role of digital cash and tried to do the smart contracts. We had Ethereum, which was looking to do the smart contract promise, right? And then we had CryptoKitties happen. So those that have been around in Ethereum know what I'm talking about with CryptoKitties. Those that haven't, I will explain. And then we had BitShares. So, why EOS? So that's what this is going to be about.
EOS is a decentralized autonomous corporation that is designed to allow people to build decentralized applications. It allows them to build them, host them, and govern them.
It's our first open source software. And so it allows developers to build a blockchain. And it's a programmable blockchain that allows you to deploy applications without having to have any servers. And that's just the beginning of what EOS can enable.
Right now, we're kind of at a roadblock. We have all these ideas and things that we want to actually produce, but the existing platforms do not allow us to get to a live environment. We can develop, we can get ready, but we can't actually put it into produce. So if you take a look at Steemit, if we wanted to put that on a public blockchain like Ethereum or Bitcoin, it would be looking at something around $100 to $200 million a year just to host the likes associated with that social media network.
EOS is unique in the blockchain industry because it's the first platform designed from the ground up for scalability, which means we can support millions of transactions per second with sub-second latencies.
We're closing a huge gap between what we know is capable with this industry and what existing platforms are capable of now. With Ethereum and Bitcoin, you're looking at 2 to 20 transactions a second, 5 to 6 million US dollars a day. So we're really looking at 10, 20 US dollars per transaction and very limited throughput. EOS completely changes that. In addition to being parallel, it allows for millions of transactions per second and over 50,000 transactions per thread. We've dropped the price of a transaction from something like $10, $15 per transaction to a 0.005 of a cent. So what it really is doing is it's allowing mainstream adoption of blockchain because for the first time businesses can actually build an enterprise scale application.
It's the first blockchain technology that can support real-world use cases serving millions of users. Up until this point, we've been dealing with technology that's been very exciting, creating new currencies, but it just hasn't had the throughput to enable the massive decentralization that we want to see.
Everything will be better, faster, and cheaper. Everything will be more connected. Everything will be more trustworthy. Everything will be more secure. It's not a matter of if. It's just a matter of how and by whom.
There's many sides and there's many ways to get involved in EOS. And I think that the people that get involved early are going to have the opportunity to deliver products and services faster. People that are building on the testnet will have the ability to launch a centralized application. And I think that early involvement is going to define the biggest beneficiaries.
Things are about to get real, because we have the ability to deliver services that can impact not just, tens or dozens or hundreds or thousands of lives, but millions of lives and eventually billions.
I believe everyone who loves freedom benefits from the EOS platform. That's why I'm creating EOS, to empower more people to create more tools so we can all build a freer society together. I really, really hope that in 10 years, blockchain will make us all more free and more prosperous.
Everything that exists is no longer going to exist in the way that it does today. Everything in this world is about to get better.
So you guys, hopefully you enjoyed that video. I keep contrasting Bitcoin, Ethereum, and EOS, and some of the other competitors as well in this blockchain 3.0 space, which is what we call it, which is this continual evolution in blockchain technologies. There are a couple different main topics that we can look at for some perspective. One of them is what we call the scaling performance, and this is, this could be looked at in terms of the number of transactions per second that some of these platforms can handle. With Bitcoin, as of right now, we are limited to somewhere around 3 transactions per second. With Ethereum, it's somewhere around 30 transactions per second. Now, I should say that, and quite honestly, I will. This is prior to any updates in maybe the second half of 2018. But as of right now, Ethereum is limited to 30 transactions per second. We have limited complete use cases for a blockchain outside of Bitcoin itself. There are a couple exceptions to this. I mentioned Ethereum's successful token of ICOs. but there's no real end products just yet. Or there's a couple, but maybe they're more in the beta phase. Some of them are using parachains because of the issues with pushing transactions through the Ethereum network. The other exception would be Steemit, which is a social blog and content community area, and that's actually been pretty successful. And then we have BitShares, which I mentioned earlier, which is a DEX or a distributed exchange. But the issue with that is it's not quite as user-friendly as it probably should be. So those are a couple examples of some of the ones I'm aware of, but again, pretty limited. And if also you look at these are based on code that is often not very friendly for traditional programmers, okay? So you take a language on Ethereum, which is Solidity, and you compare that to traditional languages. There just isn't many Solidity developers, or yeah, I would say developers out there. Many of these projects are still dependent on centralized crypto gateways. So again, Coinbase is a good example of that. Like, so if you have a user that wants access to your product or your project, you have to go through Coinbase first, get exposure to Ethereum, and then convert that into a token that you like, right? That you want to support or you want to use. Well, anytime you do that, as I mentioned in my previous video, that is considered that could be considered a taxable event in some jurisdictions, especially in the United States. Do you think your mom or your dad or any of your friends who aren't crypto nerds are going to want to do that? I would bet you, I bet you a nice meal out somewhere that it's unlikely they would want to put up with that stuff. So successful blockchains are going to need to find a way to minimize the amount of technical steps to get from fiat into using the ecosystem. And if you have these coins, which you